The casino was electric, poker chips clacking, champagne corks popping, victory cheers erupting from the roulette tables. But at the corner VIP booth, the most feared man in the city sat in absolute stillness. He didn't come here to gamble. He came here to close a deal that would expand his empire into 3 new territories. But before the waitress even reached his table, something caught his eye. A flash of white against dark mahogany. A cocktail napkin, sliding across the polished wood surface as she set down his bourbon. He almost dismissed it until he saw the writing. Hasty shaking, written in desperate black ink. Just one word, help. He looked up. Across the green felt table, the waitress stood frozen, her serving tray trembling in her hands. Her jaw tight, her eyes screaming, her breath coming in shallow bursts as if she was drowning in plain sight. Behind the bar, a man in an expensive suit watched her every move. Too focused, too intense, too threatening. The casino manager walked right past her, completely blind to the terror etched into every muscle of her face. But the Mafia boss didn't miss it. His tattooed fingers slowly wrapped around the napkin, gripping it like evidence at a crime scene he was seconds away from creating. She had chosen him. Of all the people in this room, the high rollers, the security guards, the bartenders, she had chosen the one man capable of turning an elegant evening into a bloodbath. And when his eyes locked onto hers, every enforcer positioned around the perimeter tensed because they had never seen that expression cross Carlo Gambino's face before. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will expose a war brewing in the shadows and reveal why this waitress gambled her life on the monster at the poker table. If you're gripped right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 2,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this, about desperate choices and dangerous alliances, deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Carlo Gambino had been called many things in his 41 years: executioner, emperor, apex predator. But tonight, sitting in the Velvet Rose Casino Lounge, he was just a businessman finalizing a partnership that would give him control over half the city's underground gambling operations. The casino hummed with the usual Thursday night energy, couples testing their luck at blackjack, corporate executives celebrating quarterly bonuses with $100 chips, politicians making backroom handshakes over scotch. None of them knew they were playing cards 30 feet away from the head of the most ruthless crime syndicate on the West Coast. Carlo preferred it that way. Visibility was a weakness. The second people recognized you, they either scattered like roaches or started plotting your assassination. He learned that lesson watching his mentor take a bullet to the skull outside a parking garage when he was 19. His knuckles tapped a slow rhythm against the leather armrest as he surveyed the room. His contact should have arrived 10 minutes ago. Dante Russo, his former lieutenant, his trusted enforcer, the man who had supposedly retired to open a legitimate security firm in Phoenix after 20 years of service. But Dante hadn't retired. Carlo had intelligence, surveillance footage, financial transactions, testimonies from informants too scared to fabricate stories. Dante had been building his own network, recruiting Carlo's soldiers, siphoning money from their operations, and now running an extortion ring that specialized in targeting families. Tonight was supposed to be their reckoning. But instead of Dante walking through the entrance, Carlo's attention fixed on something far more unexpected. A woman in a black vest and bow tie, her dark hair pulled into a severe ponytail, her posture rigid as steel. Jessica Stroud, according to the name tag pinned to her chest. She approached his table with the practiced grace of someone who'd served 1,000 drinks, but her hands betrayed her. They shook. Just slightly. Just enough for a man who'd spent 3 decades reading people's final moments to know this woman was standing on the edge of an abyss. And then she placed the napkin on his table. Their eyes met for less than a second, but in that fraction of time, Carlo saw everything. The kind of fear that doesn't come from losing money or facing embarrassment. The kind of fear that comes from knowing someone you love is about to die, and you're the only one who can stop it. Carlo Gambino didn't believe in coincidences. And he sure as hell didn't believe in heroes. But as he unfolded that napkin and read the words scrawled in desperate ink, he realized something that made his blood run cold. He'd been so focused on hunting Dante Russo that he'd walked straight into a trap. And this terrified waitress trying to save his life had just become the only ally he had in a room full of enemies. The question wasn't whether he could save her. The question was whether either of them would make it out alive. Carlo's eyes moved across the casino floor like a predator scanning a watering hole, cataloging threats before they materialized. 30 years in the underworld had turned observation into reflex. He didn't just see people, he read them. The nervous businessman at table 7 who kept checking his phone, likely hiding gambling losses from his wife. The couple at the bar who sat too close, their body language screaming affair rather than marriage. The security guard near the vault door who shifted his weight every 43 seconds, bored but alert. Then there was the cocktail waitress in Section 3. Jessica. Her movements were too mechanical, like someone going through motions they'd rehearsed in a mirror. She smiled at customers, but the smile never reached her eyes. When she delivered drinks, her gaze swept the room in a pattern that had nothing to do with good service and everything to do with surveillance. Or fear. Carlo watched her navigate between tables with the rigid posture of a soldier walking through a minefield. Most people wouldn't notice. They'd see an attractive woman doing her job, maybe having an off night. But Carlo had spent 3 decades identifying people who were about to break. He'd seen that same locked jaw on men moments before they confessed under interrogation. That same controlled breathing on informants about to flip. That same darting glance on targets who knew the Reaper was in the room but couldn't pinpoint where. She was looking for someone. Or looking to avoid someone. He tracked her progression across the floor, noting how she avoided certain sections entirely. How she kept her back to the walls whenever possible. How her free hand kept drifting to her apron pocket, touching something there, then pulling away as if it burned. When she finally started toward his table, Carlos saw it, the imperceptible change in her breathing, the way her knuckles went white around the serving tray, the split-second hesitation before she committed to the approach. Whatever was about to happen, she'd been building toward this moment all night. And Carlo Gambino hadn't survived this long by ignoring his instincts. His right hand slipped beneath the table, fingers brushing the Glock holstered against his ribs. His left hand lifted his glass of bourbon, taking a slow sip while his eyes never left the woman walking straight into what looked like her own execution. She stopped 3 feet from his table, and that's when he saw her lips move, forming words she couldn't speak out loud. That's when he knew this wasn't just fear. This was someone drowning, reaching for the only lifeline in sight. Even if that lifeline had a body count that would fill a cemetery. Jessica's hands trembled as she lifted the bourbon from her tray, the amber liquid creating tiny ripples against the crystal. To the couple laughing at the adjacent table, it would be invisible. To the pit boss scanning the floor, it would be nothing. But to Carlo Gambino, who had watched men try to steady their grip before signing confessions, before pulling triggers, before taking their last breath, it was a neon sign screaming distress. She set the glass down with practiced precision, the kind of control that came from willpower, not composure. Then came the napkin. White linen, folded into a perfect triangle, placed deliberately beside his drink. Her fingers lingered on it for half a heartbeat longer than necessary, and that's when their eyes met. Brown eyes locked with his, and in that fraction of a second, Carlos saw past the professional mask she wore. He saw terror. Not the shallow fear of losing a job or making a mistake. The deep, primal terror of someone watching the clock tick down to an execution. Her gaze broke away, but not before he caught the microscopic glance she threw toward the bar. Carlo didn't follow her eyes, didn't give away that he'd noticed. Instead, He reached for the napkin with the casual indifference of a man who'd ordered 1,000 drinks in 1,000 establishments. His fingers unfolded the linen, expecting nothing. The word hit him like a bullet. Help. Written in shaky black ink, the letters uneven, desperate. The P trailed off as if her hand had been shaking too violently to finish properly. Carlo's expression didn't change. He'd trained himself decades ago to keep his face blank when receiving information that could mean war, death, or betrayal. But his mind shifted into the cold, tactical mode that had kept him alive through 3 assassination attempts and 2 federal investigations. He looked up at Jessica, who was already turning to leave, her professionalism a fragile shell around whatever hell she was trapped inside. Around them, the casino continued its symphony of greed and chance. Slot machines chimed. Dice clattered. Dealers called numbers. A woman shrieked with joy at a winning hand. But at Carlo's table, time had frozen into a single, crystalline moment of understanding. This woman was screaming. Not with her voice, because someone had stolen that from her. Not with her body, because she was being watched. She was screaming with 4 letters on a napkin, trusting that the most dangerous man in the room would hear what no one else could. And despite every instinct telling him to walk away, to let someone else's catastrophe remain someone else's problem, Carlo Gambino folded the napkin and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Because he'd hurt her. And now there would be consequences. Carlo lifted his bourbon glass, tilting it just enough to catch the reflection of the room in its curved surface. An old trick learned from a Russian arms dealer in Prague who'd survived 16 years by never turning his back on a door. The distorted image showed him what he needed to see without broadcasting that he was looking. Near the entrance, a man in a charcoal suit pretended to study his phone, but his eyes tracked every movement at Carlo's table. By the roulette wheel, another figure leaned against a column with the false casualness of someone trying too hard to blend in. Carlo recognized the stance, the way his right hand stayed near his hip, the bulge beneath his jacket that screamed concealed carry to anyone who knew what to look for. He set the glass down and reached for his silver cigarette case, using the polished metal like a mirror as he opened it. The reflection captured the bar area. There, partially obscured by hanging pendant lights, sat a man Carlo would recognize anywhere. Dante Russo. Older now, his hair graying at the temples, but still carrying himself with that same arrogant posture that had always grated on Carlo's nerves. Dante wasn't hiding. He wanted to be seen. This wasn't surveillance. It was theater. Carlo's jaw tightened as the pieces assembled themselves with brutal clarity. The waitress wasn't random. She was leverage. Dante had positioned his men at every exit. Carlo counted at least 5, probably more blending with casino security. They weren't carrying the weapons for a robbery. Robbery was loud, chaotic, inefficient. This setup was surgical. They'd turned the entire casino floor into a kill box, and Jessica was the bait that had drawn him into it. Smart. Ruthlessly smart. Use an innocent woman to make Carlo lower his guard, to keep him rooted to one location while the noose tightened. If Carlo tried to leave, they'd move. If he stayed, they'd wait for the perfect moment. Either way, he was trapped in a scenario where any aggressive action would result in civilian casualties. Dante knew Carlo's reputation, knew he avoided collateral damage when possible. It was bad for business and worse for maintaining the delicate balance that kept law enforcement at arm's length. Carlo took a slow drag from his cigarette, his mind running through scenarios at lightning speed. Dante had spent months planning this. Maybe years. Every angle was covered, every variable accounted for. Except one. Dante had assumed Carlo would react like he always did, with calculated restraint, measured responses, strategic withdrawal. But Dante had forgotten the cardinal rule of hunting predators. When you back them into a corner with someone they've decided to protect, restraint becomes the first casualty. And Carlo Gambino had just made a decision that would turn this casino into a war zone. Carlo raised 2 fingers, the universal signal for another drink. Jessica's head snapped toward him, her eyes widening with something between hope and terror. She approached with the same rigid control, the bourbon bottle gripped in her white-knuckled hand. As she leaned forward to pour, Carlos shifted slightly, closing the distance until his lips were inches from her ear. To anyone watching, it looked like a wealthy patron making an inappropriate comment to staff. Exactly what he wanted them to think. Who has her? 3 words, delivered in a whisper so low it barely qualified as sound. Jessica's hand trembled violently, bourbon splashing over the rim of his glass. She recovered quickly, setting the bottle on the table to steady herself. My sister, Maya. They took her from her apartment this morning. Her voice was barely audible, each word a fragment of the scream trapped inside her throat. Said if I don't put the vial in your drink by midnight, they'll kill her. Carlo's eyes remained fixed on the poker chips in front of him, his expression bored, disinterested. Where's the vial? Left apron pocket. Jessica's breath hitched. Please, I didn't want to, I would never. The man at the bar. He's watching you. Carlo's tone was clinical, emotionless, the voice of someone solving a tactical problem rather than discussing murder. How long have you known him? I've never seen him before tonight. He approached me during my shift, showed me a video of Maya tied to a chair. Said I had until midnight or she disappears. The bottle rattled against the table as she set it down. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. If that confession hit you, if you felt the weight of her impossible choice, like this video. Subscribe and hit that bell. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place? Your stories fuel these tales. Now, let's see his answer. Carlo reached for his glass, examining the amber liquid as if considering its quality. In reality, he was calculating timelines, exit strategies, the precise sequence of events needed to dismantle Dante's operation before that deadline arrived. Midnight. He checked his Rolex without appearing to. 11:42. 18 minutes. The location. Where are they holding her? I don't know. They wouldn't tell me. Said they'd text me after. Her voice cracked. After it was done. Carlo took a slow sip of his bourbon, buying himself 3 seconds to think. Dante was smarter than he'd given him credit for. No location meant Jessica couldn't compromise the operation even if she wanted to. It also meant Carlo couldn't send his people ahead. This was a gamble with levs as currency, and Dante was holding all the cards. Carlo set down his glass and looked directly at Jessica for the first time since she'd arrived. His eyes were cold, flat, the eyes of a man who'd made decisions that ended lives without losing sleep. But beneath that ice was something else. Something that looked almost like conviction. Trust me. Keep working. For words, spoken with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never failed when he made a promise. Carlo stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate slowness. He caught the eye of his head of security, a mountain of a man named Victor, and gave the slightest nod toward the VIP lounge on the second floor. Victor's expression didn't change, but his hand drifted toward his concealed weapon. Carlo didn't look back as he walked toward the spiral staircase, his footsteps measured, unhurried. A man going to make a phone call, nothing more. He felt Dante's presence before he heard him. The creak of leather shoes on mahogany stairs, the faint smell of expensive cologne mixed with something darker. Anticipation. The VIP lounge was empty, exactly as Carlo had expected. Dante had reserved it, turned it into a stage for whatever performance he'd been rehearsing. Carlo poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter, his back to the entrance. 3 years, Dante. You could have been anywhere in the world. Instead, you came back to my city. Our city. Dante's voice carried that same smooth confidence it always had, the tone of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room. I built half of what you claim is yours. Recruited half your soldiers. Brokered half your deals. Then you cast me out like garbage because I had ambition. Carlo turned, glass in hand. Dante looked prosperous. Tailored suit, platinum watch, the unmistakable glow of someone who'd been living well. You were stealing. From the families. From me. I was innovating. Dante smiled, and it was the smile of a shark circling wounded prey. But that's ancient history, Carlo. Tonight is about the future. Or rather, your lack of one. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen with theatrical flair. Recognize these? Carlo's jaw tightened as he looked at the images. Bank statements showing transfers from his accounts to offshore havens. Emails with his digital signature authorizing the sale of family assets. Video footage of him meeting with federal agents, the angles carefully chosen to look like cooperation rather than confrontation. Forgeries, Carlo said flatly. Brilliant forgeries, Dante corrected. Good enough that I've already sent copies to the 5 families. To your captains. To your most trusted advisors. By tomorrow morning, they'll all believe you've been robbing them blind and cutting deals with the FBI. He pocketed his phone. Your empire will tear itself apart from the inside, and you'll be lucky if they grant you the mercy of a quick death. Carlo's fingers tightened around his glass. And the girl's sister? What does she have to do with this? Insurance. Dante's smile widened. You die tonight, poisoned by a terrified waitress in front of witnesses, and the narrative writes itself. Carlo Gambino, so paranoid and corrupt that his own people turned on him. Or you refuse to drink, and I kill the girl anyway, along with enough civilians to make you look like a monster who caused a massacre. He spread his hands. Either way, your legacy becomes ashes. Just like my career did when you exiled me. Carlos stared at the man he'd once called brother, seeing clearly now what he'd missed before. This wasn't about money or territory. This was about erasing him from history itself. Dante pulled out his phone again, this time opening a video feed. The screen showed a young woman, early 20s, bound to a metal chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Maya. Her face was bruised, tears streaming down her cheeks, a gag tied around her mouth. Behind her stood 2 men Carlo didn't recognize, both armed with pistols. Here's how this ends, Carlo. Dante's voice was silk over steel. You go back downstairs. You let that sweet, terrified waitress pour the poison into your drink. You die in front of everyone, and I make sure Maya walks out of that warehouse alive. You become a tragic story, a cautionary tale about paranoia and betrayal, but at least you die with some dignity intact. He tilted the phone so Carlo could see Maya struggling against her restraints. Or you refuse, and I give the order right now. My men put a bullet in her head, and I send the video to every news outlet in the city. Then I detonate the charges my people have placed throughout this casino, and you get to watch 100 innocent people die because you chose your pride over their lives. Carlo's eyes moved to his Rolex. 11:52. 8 minutes. He could feel the weight of every second pressing against his chest like a physical force. Dante had trapped him in a scenario where every option led to destruction. Save the girl, die and lose everything he'd built. Refuse, and become the monster responsible for a massacre. You always were theatrical, Carlo said quietly. He reached into his jacket, and Dante's hand moved toward his weapon. But Carlo only pulled out his phone. You spend months planning this. Building your case. Positioning your people. But you forgot something, Dante. What's that? Dante's confidence flickered for just a second. I've survived 30 years by never walking into a room without an exit strategy. Carlo pressed a single button on his phone, a pre-programmed code that would send an emergency signal to Victor. 3 short vibrations. The signal they developed years ago for scenarios exactly like this. Victor would know what it meant. Locate, extract, eliminate. Carlo pocketed his phone and picked up his scotch glass. I'm going back downstairs. I'm going to sit at that table. And I'm going to drink whatever Jessica puts in front of me. He met Dante's eyes, and for the first time that night, allowed himself a cold smile. But you're going to lose. Because you assumed I'd play by your rules. There are no other rules, Dante said, but something in his voice had shifted. Uncertainty creeping in like fog. Then you've already lost. Carlo walked past him toward the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Because the only rule I've ever followed is this: protect what matters, destroy what threatens it, and never let them see you coming. Behind him, Dante stood frozen, watching Carlo descend the staircase like a man walking toward his own execution. But for the first time since this began, Dante felt something he hadn't anticipated: doubt. Carlo settled back into his chair at the poker table, his movements unhurried, almost casual. Around him, the casino continued its oblivious symphony. A woman laughed at the craps table. Slot machines sang their digital promises. Dealers shuffled cards with mechanical precision. None of them knew they were about to witness a murder. Jessica appeared at his elbow, her face drained of color, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the serving tray. Carlo could see the internal war raging behind her eyes. The vial was in her apron pocket. Midnight was 4 minutes away. Her sister's life hung in the balance, and the only path forward required her to become a killer. Carlo raised his empty glass, a silent request. Jessica's breath caught in her throat, a sound like a trapped animal realizing the cage door had locked. She reached for the bourbon bottle with trembling fingers, then hesitated. Her eyes found his, pleading, desperate, asking a question she couldn't voice. Is there another way? Carlo gave the slightest nod. Do it. Trust me. Jessica's hand disappeared into her apron pocket. When it emerged, her fingers were wrapped around the neck of the bourbon bottle, and Carlo knew the vial's contents were already mixing with the amber liquid. She poured with the mechanical movements of someone watching themselves from outside their own body. The glass filled. The poison swirled invisible in the whiskey. A murder weapon disguised as hospitality. Carlo lifted the glass, examining it in the low light as if appreciating its quality. He could feel Dante's eyes on him from across the casino floor, could sense the man's anticipation like static electricity in the air. This was the moment Dante had orchestrated, the culmination of months of planning, the checkmate he'd been building toward. Carlo brought the glass to his lips and drank. The bourbon burned down his throat, smooth and expensive and lethal. He took a second sip, then a third, draining half the glass before setting it down. Jessica's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she watched the man she'd just poisoned calmly return to his poker hand. 30 seconds passed. Carlo felt the first wave hit him, a cold numbness spreading from his stomach outward. His vision wavered at the edges, colors bleeding into each other like watercolors in rain. He'd taken the antidote 15 minutes ago, a fast-acting compound his personal physician had provided for exactly this type of scenario. But antidotes weren't perfect. They bought time. They didn't guarantee survival. Carlo's hand went to his chest, fingers clutching at his shirt. The casino floor tilted sideways. Voices erupted around him, sharp and panicked. Someone screamed. His bodyguards rushed forward, but Carlo was already falling, his chair toppling backward as his body hit the floor. Through blurring vision, he saw Dante's men converging. Saw Jessica's horrified face hovering above him. Saw the overhead lights spinning like distant stars. His last conscious thought before darkness claimed him was simple, brutal, and certain: let them think they've won. 2 of Dante's men pushed through the growing crowd, their hands closing around Jessica's arms with bruising force. Come with us, miss. We need to ask you some questions about what happened. Their voices were professional, concerned, the perfect imitation of security doing their job. But Jessica felt the gun barrels pressed against her ribs through their jackets, felt the way their grips promised violence if she resisted. Then the front entrance exploded inward. Not literally, but the effect was the same. Victor came through the doors like a tidal wave, 8 men flanking him, all armed, all moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Casino patrons screamed and scattered. Dealers dove behind tables. The carefully orchestrated chaos Dante had created shattered into real pandemonium. Victor's voice cut through the noise like a chainsaw. Release her. Now. Dante's men hesitated for one fatal second, hands moving toward their weapons. They never cleared leather. Victor's team moved with surgical efficiency, disarming them before they could draw, forcing them to the ground with the kind of violence that left no room for negotiation. Within 30 seconds, every one of Dante's operatives was on their knees, hands zip-tied behind their backs. On the floor, Carlo's eyes snapped open. The antidote had done its job, keeping his vitals stable, buying him the minutes he needed. His vision was still blurred, his muscles weak, but he was alive. He pushed himself up on his elbows, and the look on Dante's face from across the casino made every second of agony worth it. Victor crossed to Carlo, helping him to his feet. Maya Stroud. Found her in a warehouse on 5th and Madison. She's scared but unharmed. Your doctor is with her now. He handed Carlo his phone. And we've got a recording you'll want to hear. Carlo pressed play. Dante's voice crackled through the speaker, confident and clear. The target is down. Execute the girl. Make it clean. The timestamp showed it had been sent 3 minutes ago, right after Carlo collapsed. But the message had never reached its destination. Victor's people had intercepted it, used it to triangulate Maya's location, and extracted her before Dante's backup plan could unfold. Dante stood frozen near the VIP lounge entrance, watching his perfect revenge disintegrate. He'd accounted for Carlo's bodyguards. He'd anticipated resistance. But he hadn't anticipated that Carlo would weaponize his own death, that the collapse itself would be the trigger that forced Dante to reveal his hand. Carlo walked toward him, each step steadier than the last. When he spoke, his voice carried across the silent casino like a judge reading a sentence. You forgot the most important rule, Dante. In this business, you don't celebrate until you've confirmed the body. And you never, ever underestimate a man fighting for someone other than himself. Dante's hand moved toward his weapon, but Victor's gun was already pressed against his temple. The game was over, and Dante had lost everything. 3 weeks later, the Velvet Rose had returned to its familiar rhythm. The bullet holes had been patched, the broken furniture replaced, the blood scrubbed from the marble floors. The casino management had spun the incident as a targeted robbery attempt, and the media had moved on to fresher scandals. In Carlo's world, chaos could be cleaned up and forgotten if you paid the right people enough money. Carlo sat at the same corner table, a glass of bourbon in front of him untouched. He'd been coming here every Thursday since that night, always alone, always at the same time. Some of his men thought it was a power move, a statement that he refused to be driven from his territory. But Carlo knew the truth. He came back because this was where something had changed, where the code he'd lived by for 30 years had been rewritten in 4 desperate letters. Jessica approached without the tremor that had defined her movements that night. Her posture was relaxed, confident, the bearing of someone who'd walked through fire and discovered she was fireproof. She carried a tray, but this time there was no bourbon bottle, no hidden vial. Just a simple wooden frame wrapped in brown paper. She set it on the table without ceremony. I wanted you to have this. Carlo unwrapped it carefully. Inside the frame was a photograph, Jessica and Maya standing on a beach somewhere tropical, sun-kissed and smiling with the unbridled joy of people who'd been given a second chance at life. But beneath the photograph, pressed under glass like a museum artifact, was the napkin. The word help still visible in shaky black ink, the P trailing off where her hand had trembled too violently to finish. Maya wanted me to throw it away, Jessica said quietly. Said it was a reminder of the worst night of our lives. But I told her it was also a reminder of the best thing anyone's ever done for us. For me. Her eyes met his, clear and steady. Thank you, Mr. Gambino, for hearing what I couldn't say out loud. Carlo studied the frame, his tattooed fingers tracing the edge of the glass. Where's Maya now? Graduate school. Psychology. She wants to help people who've been through trauma. Jessica smiled. She says surviving gives you perspective. Smart girl. Carlo looked up at her. You're not afraid anymore. No. Jessica's voice was firm, certain. I learned something that night. Sometimes the monsters under the bed are the only ones who can fight the monsters in the room. After she left, Carlos sat alone with the frame in his hands. He'd built an empire on fear, maintained it through violence, expanded it with ruthlessness. He'd been called a monster for 3 decades, and he'd worn that title like armor. But this napkin, this desperate plea from a terrified woman, had revealed something he'd forgotten in all those years of blood and territory. If this story touched you, if you believe even monsters can protect the innocent, thank you. These tales live because of you. Smash like, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a heart in the comments if you believe power should protect, not destroy. It means everything. Power without purpose was just violence. But power used to protect the innocent, that was something worth the price he'd paid. Carlo placed the frame in his briefcase, already deciding where it would hang in his office. Not as a trophy, but as a compass. A reminder that the throne meant nothing if he lost sight of who he was supposed to protect while sitting on it.